Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 23rd paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Second Peculiarity, the Living Reaction. The text follows. The second peculiarity in war is the living reaction and the reciprocal action resulting therefrom. We do not here speak of the difficulty of estimating that reaction, for that is included in the difficulty before mentioned of treating the moral powers as quantities, but of this that the reciprocal action by its nature opposes anything like a regular plan. The effect which any measure produces upon the enemy is the most distinct of all the data which action affords. But every theory must keep to classes or groups of phenomena and can never take up the really individual case in itself. That must everywhere be left to judgment and talent. It is therefore natural that in a business such as war, which in its plan, built upon general circumstances, is so often thwarted by unexpected and singular accidents, more must generally be left to talent, and less use can be made of a theoretical guide than in any other. So this is a bit more of a conceptual paragraph, at least compared to the ones that we have read last times, and it begins to shift the attention, maybe with not much of a continuation in the following paragraphs, but still meaningfully in the general picture of the theory as it's been, or the foundations of the theory are as they're being set here as, or at least their conditions, if you want, to the individuality, like in the exceptional nature of every single situation, and that this exceptionality fundamentally rests mostly, or at least in very important part, on the fact that we are acting against a living being, right? We're not fighting against a mechanical system that we can just study physically speaking, but as we've seen also in the previous paragraphs, and we have commented a big deal on this, on a spiritual force, right? On a moral force that is very flexible and extremely capable of synthesis, of reaction, as a matter of fact. And this is a reaction for survival, right? In war, I go there to kill you, essentially, and you have to strike back in a way that naturally is, the strongest, the more the pressure you have. From my side, in part, is, and not just from that side, for that matter, but still, producing an even more desperate reaction into you on the basis of my action. So, at least for aside from my poor phrasing, this is a very important part of the story, because if you think about it, most of the generalizations and prejudices we have in war, about war, start not just from the consideration that that we can't deal with, we can do without moral forces, like saying, those depend just on the situation, we can't calculate them, it's impossible, so let's stick to the physicals and the material side of the story, which is already an implicit admission of incomprehension, right? And a failure that automatically says, okay, we're doing without something that is evidently important because we considered it, but we, at the point that it's so difficult to determine, that we have eliminated it from the equation, right? Here it's, if you want, a peculiar condition of the moral force that belongs to a living being, and maybe in this paragraph von Clausewitz doesn't quite stress it as it will do in other parts, but it goes without saying, right? So this is a living being you are interacting with. So he's an intelligent being, for example, and he doesn't want to die just as much as you don't want. So this is one of those elementary realities, elementary data, evidence that make you realize that this guy is not going without a fight, right? He is, if you really have to kill him, he's probably even going to do the best he's capable of, and this can be very risky, as we all know. Never take away all the chances, all the opportunities, all the escape routes, if you want, unless you want to see how hard this guy can fight. So von Clausewitz here says excuse me, I'm looking at something. Okay, well, a second. He writes, the second peculiarity in war is the living reaction, and the reciprocal action resulting therefrom. So, always take into account, in any situation of war, that everything that we do, and everything that results from that action, is a living, has a living dimension. It's happening between two living beings, right? Let's remember that the first speciality had been that moral forces and their effects, right? The idea that there is always this moral ground, this hostile feeling between the two. Here it goes beyond. It starts entailing a broader, actual, dynamic event that takes place during the action proper, during the fight proper, not just as a hostile feeling, right? So it's as if war was dominated by this specific character of being fought between two living beings. Then von Clausewitz writes, we do not here speak of the difficulty of estimating that reaction, for that is included in the difficulty before mentioned of treating the moral powers as quantities, right? Always remember that these peculiarities von Clausewitz is talking about, so once again, moral forces and their effects and a living reaction are those elements that set the greatest difficulty for the construction of positive theory for the conduct of war. So in the previous paragraphs we have already seen how trying to quantify these moral powers is practically impossible, right? There is a way to do it, more or less, approximately, but it doesn't happen through an actual mathematical calculation. It comes from, paradoxically, our same sensitivity to, in fact, to these living creatures. I mean, we can be sympathetic even with our own enemy, and we definitely need to be so, because not that we shouldn't kill him, and that's the point of von Clausewitz, as you know, is against this simplification. Like, of course, you could have many reasons for not delivering all your worst against someone in war, and it is like this in every single real war, as von Clausewitz says. But still, theoretically, if you were allowed, in order to finish this before, and exactly for humanitarian reasons, you should make it as violent as possible since the beginning, so that can end sooner and consuming less resources, paradoxically, than what the protraction of a limited conflict would entail. And this is very interesting, because von Clausewitz says it at the beginning of the book, of the first book, when he shows you what war should be like theoretically, but showing you with a demonstration ex absurdo how effectively this is never the case in reality, right? Never. And the reason why we think sometimes this is because maybe we see an incredible amount of destruction, and even weapons of mass destruction. Still, doesn't take. It's because we take into account a limited picture when we don't consider effectively what the two contendants are really about, and where this war is waged. And there is even a kind of a spatial prejudice like that also informed in certain military cultures the interpretations of the von Clausewitz concept of Schwerpunkt, right? That is being seen like mostly as a location, sometimes like a geometrical point. Well, the concept of a Schwerpunkt is it's on infinite dimensions. It can be on everything, at every level. But the point I'm making here, I don't remember why I digressed for that, is that, however, that you must, yes, because you have to be sympathetic, right? Because you have to understand what the enemy is doing. I mean, the most precious awareness that you derive from acknowledging the second peculiarity in the difficulty of creating a positive art of war is this living reaction, that you're dealing with someone that is not a machine, and that even if it was still programmed and part of, as an extension of a human mind, and that you have to, that would be paradoxically easier to predict by certain standards, at least, you know, concrete ones, relative to reality, in fact, than a human mind. I mean, it's very, very difficult to understand a human mind, but at the same time, our minds are, you know, our mind is set on that. You know, we do feel instinctively some human feeling towards one another, but we understand what that person is mostly up to. We look back to what a person does and what they say, what they look like, and more or less we are able to understand, even not just because humans are more likely to help someone than to want to kill him, but also because when you're fighting, that dimension is the most important, essentially because that's at the moral forces we have to look. We have said it many times that war is not about, like, even during a fight, the most important thing is not, you know, the muscle of your adversary, but the way he looks like for you at that moment, because from that you could spot some weaknesses at the point you could knock him out, even if he was theoretically superior to you. And this theoretical sign is in fact the theoretical abstraction of what a situation should be like. In fact, most of the times between two people fighting, even in a 1 versus 1, bare hands, what do you think is the person that wins more easily? The person who has more muscles? Normally the person who wins more often, regularly, is the person who is more aggressive-minded. There's a person who really wants to smash that guy's face. And that's really what it is. And this is the predominance of moral forces in war. Always remember this, that von Clausewitz war is essentially a clash between moral forces. Right? It doesn't count what these material quantities are that you could theoretically. It's all about how you use them. And muscles can be translated into guns, right? And that's what it means. It's never believed that technology, paper strength, or is what makes you win. I mean, that can reflect, most of the times, actually, historically, a higher intelligence and development of civilization, but even at that point, even if it's usually the most intelligent person who wins, it's still this primordial enmity, this willing of, you know, whatever the motivation is of fighting, that actually makes the difference. And that's also what interacts in the relation between politics and war, because we have always said it, and that's probably the only phrase von Clausewitz is remembered for, is that war is just a persecution of war is just a persecution of politics by other means. Meaning what exactly? Is that politics basically has always control on war. There is not even a single moment in which there is something like absolute war. War is not an actor in itself. War has nothing conscious about itself. It's not a living being, paradoxically. It's an instrument, right? It's an instrument, because even those who fight it are guided by other reasons. So war is actually the fight in itself. It's not, and it's been kind of, if not personified, but at least believed to be a kind of a dimension in its own that takes taste from itself, etc. Because we are so emotionally shocked by what war is and its violence, but it's actually, in fact, an emotionalistic approach and doesn't take into consideration the reality of this all, that is, that politics makes war. And this is not a way to accuse the politicians. It's also saying, you know, we got rid of Nazism through violence, thank God, and you know that's the real deal, right? And that happened thanks to politics. So we should have an enormous respect towards violence in itself, because violence is not bad or good in itself. Violence is just a tool. With violence you can liberate Europe and the world from oppression as much as you can, in fact, oppress the world through that, because that's literally what it is, right? Then the problem is that very often it's very difficult to draw a line, a sharp line in that sense, between who's doing what in every situation, telling the truth. But even if there is a reality, there is a truth, and there are responsibilities from that could be measured, the problem is that we have difficulties to interpret it. And also, this is why there is so much ambiguity towards these topics. Like, one day we could talk about all the things I'm hearing about certain interpretations of the past that are reinterpretations, let's say better, that are quite disturbing, frankly, at this point in history, at the point, you know, we are even, you know, starting to question, I don't know, the value of, in fact, the liberation of resistance and things like these, for the sake of, for moral relativism, and essentially because that equates to historical ignorance, lack, you know, historical education, awareness, and whatever. And that's why studying military history is particularly important, because studying military history makes you see constantly who's doing what, especially in wars, in what we consider the most important, you know, the pinnacles of conflict, as such. I was thinking, excuse me, about this. In general, reflecting, in fact, on looking at the dynamic, in fact, and the link between politics and war, right? And I was saying this because this living reaction is deriving essentially from this link. Is deriving from the fact that politics always control the military action. So when you're fighting against someone, you're not really fighting against his weapons or the way he's equipped. You're fighting chiefly against the mind of that person. You know, you don't need to destroy all the material forces of the enemy to defeat the enemy. And this is obvious, and this is, I mean, this is not an exception. There are no exceptions. It's always like that in every single human war that has ever existed, that exists and that will ever exist. It will always remain in the same identical thing. This is not a cliche. In fact, I hate when people say, you know, war is always the same, like saying war is always kind of about ugly stuff and corruption. I mean, ugly stuff from a military point of view, corruption from political point of view. So this catastrophistic, defeatistic mess that, no, war is always the same. In a much more, paradoxically, much more positive, this is what von Clausewitz says, I mean, positive in the sense it can be interpreted scientifically, through knowledge, thing. War is really always the same thing. It doesn't change, because what we do as humans doesn't change, because in order to do that, you would have to change your own genes, and therefore not being human anymore. So this opens to many other digression. I will spare you today from my usual rant against culturalism, but I think you know what I think about that, why it is so important to get that right when you study from Clausewitz. Please don't talk to me about Kagan, don't talk to me about, you know, there are certain things that should be set straight, and still haven't done that video against culturalism, but just my advice for now is beware, right? Beware, in fact, keen, little heart, and especially more in general towards anyone who dares intellectually to challenge what von Clausewitz wrote, right? Because most of the times, if you do it, it's because you have never read von Clausewitz, not even I don't even say studied, but not even understood, not even read. And you may think I'm kind of radical in this attitude, but it's actually not a fideistic approach. I truly believe in what I'm saying, because nobody paid me. Von Clausewitz didn't leave me any property in his testament or whatever. I don't have any connection whatsoever. I don't earn a cent from this, but I think it's useful for the world, right? It's useful for a healthy approach to things like politics, like war, like society, and a better understanding of history as well. Because if you think that war is just a weird party that is done just to make someone gain from it at the expenses of the poor people, that's just rhetorics, right? It's not that these things that don't happen, but they do happen in contexts where it's politics or society that makes it happen, not war as such. And still, most what happens in the world, it happens for real competition between states, not because of special interests of a segment of society, as many people actually believe. Even if there is someone who profits from that, and there is definitely that, but still, this is virtually influent most of the times to the general, but actually all the times, I would say historically, what effectively happens. Also because war has an enormous cost in itself. And that's a problem. You can't, even if war was fought with this logic, you should still come to mitigate it in some way, because that you would burn all what society, your own state is, right, in a very short time. So it is not true, and do not believe these things, because it's just dumb, right? Stay open, right? No, but you don't have to be dogmatic about this. You have simply to stay open and understanding, not presuming to know things without testing and without validating it with actual proof of that. Alright, so what were here? Okay, but so we were talking. We stopped at this semicolon where he had said that this. But of this, that reciprocal action by its nature poses anything like a regular plan. Alright, so this is also very important, because it's really the key of the concept here. So the fact that this reciprocal action between living beings occurs in war, in its nature opposes anything like a regular plan, which means that it's exactly the impossibility of calculating moral powers as quantities that cannot make you formalize a regular plan, and that plans always evolve as the fight goes on, as the war goes on, right? Because the situation changes constantly, right? So it's not just a matter of not being able to assess moral powers, it's also a matter that these change, right? Just think, if morale of a person or an army or a state would remain always the same, it would be a pretty messed up reality to live in, right? Instead, fortunately, we don't work like that. And so, as von Clausewitz makes us realize here, paradoxically, this is where the positive understanding starts coming from, indirectly, because it's exactly by realizing that these powers flow, that you can switch the attention towards what makes them flow, but through time, like through experience, right? Through a capacity of understanding the other, the enemy as a living being, and not presuming that it works like a machine, right? So the regular plan here is basically what the result of an alleged positive theory of the art of war would produce, right? So something you could easily say, okay, well, this works this way because I decided it. Well, it doesn't. Try it, and you will fail most of the times, because there is no plan. I mean, if you remain past, this would entail basically what? That you set everything in a auto mode, like you left the artificial intelligence, not even the artificial intelligence playing it, or maybe yes, if you set the complex system that can't even react to certain stimuli, but as if this was a reality you don't have to change. The more, as long as it the fight progresses, right? And the enemy will find at that point, if that was the case, the way to beat it, right? But von Clausewitz is even deeper here, because he isn't telling you like that he's simply talking to you about the absurdity of the idea. And probably the most important thing you can draw from here is to jump beyond, in fact, this positive approach, this positivistic approach to reality, but assessing that whoever finds himself in that situation will actually not use a regular plan whatsoever. Like, not even those advocates that were existing at von Clausewitz's time, exactly what he's writing the Vom Kriege for, like for confuting, essentially, wouldn't absolutely try to applicate their own positivistic approaches to war, simply because in their minds they were considering themselves as scientists that were experimenting that on the field, while they had to be contented during the process of just acting in a different way, basically through the art of warfare, as it already exists de facto without formal theorization, and therefore would simply act upon what von Clausewitz is saying. Actually, that you can't have a regular plan. You have to change it immediately, as soon as you meet the enemy, because at that point you will immediately know something more that can better your plan from your understanding, from your perspective, that what you didn't know before, and it goes like that till the very last engagement. And interestingly enough, your understanding about this may not actually be correct, right? You may not actually understand what the war has been about up to that point. Of course, you would in absolute terms gain some better understanding of it, but still, this is the product of a situation that can change radically from a moment to another without you having the means to understand it. So that experience has surely made you more aware about that this can happen, but still can easily occur that you don't learn much for the next war, because maybe you haven't understood what has happened in the one you have fought completely, or in a battle, or this is very important, and we say it all the times, because of military history, and that's what the importance of military history is. It's not a passive indicator, something that happens without actual as if you what happened was just to fit what you presume it would happen. No, this military historical material has the capacity of molding, in fact, your own understanding about the art of war, because the art of war is literally based upon that, right? Even having a direct military experience, because from Clausewitz, the theory of the art of war basically stems from these two fields, like direct military experience, which makes the most of it in practice, and military history. And if military history wasn't there, it wouldn't you? It's as if, however, they were both two forms of experience, right? Direct or indirect, through different means, if you want, but still giving you some elements, some knowledge, some understanding of what happened at one point. And this doesn't mean that you fully understand it, doesn't mean that you fully know it, or that you fully got it right? Not even if you were in the battle. And so we should eliminate from this picture the idea that who witnesses war actually understands it, right? And this is once again the emotionalistic approach. I know what war is because I've suffered because of a war. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but still, from a rational point of view, that has literally nothing to do. It's like those people who say, you can't talk about history, I don't know, because you weren't born in those years, you don't know what it was like. No, I actually can. At least I can know it better than you presume to be doing, because there is also this, in fact, positivistic attitude, like, I understand. As if politics, war, or society were things that people could understand just by living through reality without actually studying them expressly, or pretending that even by doing that they would come to a satisfying overall knowledge of it. Well, this attitude is actually very widespread, and it mostly stems, in fact, from this presumption that, from ignorance in part, because it derives from the presumption of that reality is simple to decipher, right? And von Clausewitz tells you this is actually not easy to understand at all, but not even for we, like veterans like him, that we have been there and we have spent great part of our lives in combat, or well, not in combat, well, at least in positions of command, etc., as military men, etc. So that's quite meaningful. And consider that von Clausewitz was a general, chief of state. He had risen through the ranks, so he came to those spheres of knowledge about military phenomenon that are, in fact, even as his own theory explains, the highest. Right? You understand much more about war from the top than from the bottom, counterintuitively. Right? Today our attention is all about the lower ranks, right? Because I don't know why. Because it's cooler. From an entertainmental point of view, you like explosions, tracers, bombs, shouts, something, adrenalinic, heartbreaking, shockingly entertaining, or because we play a lot of video games and first-person shooters, or we like more extensively, more broadly, this warrior-like individualism. At the point we think that what actually matters is that what the soldier does, the single soldier does in battlefield. Well, statistically, it's not the case. It's overwhelmingly not the case, and it's really what happens at the top that basically nobody cares about. That is interesting. So I must say, I'm one of those people that believes that there is a higher awareness about military problems by certain standards, even through these forms of entertainment. But I still warn from, don't believe that what you see actually corresponds to what you should be knowing in order to understand what war really is, right? Being expert about, and it's weird because I actually write a PhD thesis about tactics, so tactics are easier, is easier than strategy, right? So it's a shortcut in many ways. It's funnier. It's funny to study battles. Let's be honest about that. Yet it's not from there that you get the most meaningful things. Objectively, you get the most meaningful things from strategy, but also even more coupled with a comprehensive study of war, and especially of the art of war, right? So from a diachronical approach about politics and society. If you don't do that, you can't understand it. And I know that this is somewhat sometimes anecdotal. Say, oh well, then you belong to the new military history mindset from which, yeah, we should study war just in function of politics and society. No, not really. I don't think so, because I study war directly, especially NI, and I do it at the aims of understanding. I mean, scientifically speaking, to do it with the aim of understanding war in itself. Like, I personally don't study politics or society as such. I study exclusively war, and of course that can be useful also for understanding politics and society, because the relation here is both ways. It's reciprocal. But I do it for understanding what let's say the reality of combat proper would be, at least through military historical means only. So, but never underestimate this idea that, in order to understand war, you can't just pass through war either. I mean, exclusively. Well, that literally also, in the sense that even if you are, if you have an direct experience of what war is, probably you understand. I mean, often in these videos I say, like, as if soldiers, I sound like Frederick the Great saying, I don't need my soldiers to be thinking. Soldiers today do think an astonishing lot. The average military man, at least in the United States, and I think also elsewhere in the world, is more intelligent than the average civilian, for example. Yet, the average human beings in general not very aware or educated or understand. So even in here, the more you rise through the ranks, and the more you can have someone like, I don't know, Mattis, that has an enormous military historical library, for example. That's where he's called the warrior monk. But that's what I'm talking about. We are at levels that really look at war in a way that the common private cannot see without further testing, right, of the knowledge we have comprehensively as a civilization about war, which is massive, which is extensive, right? It takes years and years even to dig into the sources we have about, like I'm doing 14th century, early 14th century, end of the 13th. Like, you can't even imagine about the stuff. If you have never tried it, it's enormous what we can learn from that. And from that period, you can't imagine, I don't know, I don't want to say easily the 20th century, but just what the 17th century, for example, is like. Nobody can cover this huge amount. So we have to be astonishingly humble before pretending that everything is easy. Because, but what I was trying to say also is that if you presume that in order to understand war, you have just to focus exclusively on war and the material dimension of war, all this great interest that takes, that exists today towards weapons and armor. It's fine, it's great. As a medievalist, a military historian can tell you it's great, but it's not everything. Most of the times, it's not even what really matters. Actually, most of the times it doesn't, because basically what was used by one people, especially kind of a regional scale, it was literally the same thing at that time in terms of technological asymmetry that the others used. Like, what do you think that the technological potential was at the time for making technology really making a difference on such realities, especially in a sectorial sense, as if one people didn't use one and the other did. Like, it doesn't make sense. So don't think that war can can you can make a synthesis of war, say, better. I don't know why in English we can't use the verb synthesize, because it's so beautiful, but apparently it doesn't exist. It's like being synthetic. Synthetic is just, synthetic materials, but if you have analytical as an adjective with the correct Hellenic etymology, why don't you use synthetic? It's so beautiful. Instead of saying concise, and you can use the verb synthesize, instead we don't use it. I don't know why, but whatever. To synthesize, let's use it. To synthesize word just through, like, as if it was a video game. So just from weapons and settings and material action from an individual perspective. This is what most of our civilization in the West looks war from as a perspective, which is bad, because it's still part of as I said, it can be good for a 30%. It's fine, let's save the 30% for what even that thing can teach us. I must say, video games are extremely useful today to understand certain aspects of war, but they're extremely limiting if they become a totalizing horizon. Let's say if they constitute the only horizon that you need in some way. So I'm not saying now, I'm not attacking anyone. I'm in the sense of, I'll look at how other people are stupid and I'm so intelligent and smart because I know von Clausewitz. No, it doesn't work like that either. We are all dramatically limited in this, but there is still a better way. And this is also what von Clausewitz is telling us, that there is a better way that you should get straight from the beginning, because it's really a matter of orientating yourself towards a right direction, right? So it's not that every person who plays an FPS should be reminded this constantly, but if that person took the next step, trying to, from that thing saying, okay, well, now I kind of understand what war is about, and that's not right. And what is worse of this, and which is the real problem at the end of the day, because the rest is, an approximation. I mean, who cares what people who play FPS think? I play it too, and it's not that it influences particularly my view of politics or society. But the problem is that sometimes there is a subculture, or let's say that develops from such interests that forms a hub that has essentially wrong foundations from a conceptual point of view, and people will enter in that hub thinking to gain benefit at that point, can even make it through the same hub, but still they are usually disoriented in the literal sense of the word, right? So I care because I realize that certain interests sometimes are even considered like that people don't care, as if even certain topics, or looking, as for example, look at Schwerpunkt. I make several videos now about kind of anthropology of war. I had also started this like being more technically oriented, but not much for my sympathy. But I reevaluate increasingly the importance of contextualizing certain aspects that actually nobody talks about. So it's important to talk about anthropology, literature, ethnology, even technology as such. I mean, considering it into a broader frame, however, that is what you should try to complete, and not focusing just on one corner and pretending to know all the rest from there, right? And I must say that if you chose military history as one of your interests, you are already on the right track, because I think that military history gives you that synthesis ability. At the point you can figure out many interesting things that subject obliges you to in fact to create, to synthesize, because studying war effectively presents you with this necessity of understanding politics, understanding war, understanding society in their links, right? And so it's as if it went by itself. So that's a good interest after all. It doesn't matter where you started. If you started from FPS, it's fine. If you started from any other apparently trivial background, like I did, even though it was entirely because of I had this, I don't know, I had this interest for war ever since I was very, very little, telling you the truth. Because it's fun, come on, who doesn't like, when I was a kid, there wasn't, I mean, there was the computer, etc., but it was like, it was mostly about television, right? So I remember even just war movies were really an attraction, were conceived to be cool, because we do live in our culture, like, but more than that, it's as human beings, we do like conflict, we do like war, we do like fighting, we do like combat. It's something that awakens in ourselves something, right, that hopefully rationality, reason says, refrain from emulating that, refrain from smashing your neighbor's head if it makes you angry, even if you feel that strong need, because it's written in our genes as apes that we should do that. But obviously we are also intelligent enough not to do it, and that's what really also von Clausewitz tells you, that that normally it's the more intelligent that wins, even in war, right? So that it doesn't mean absolutely that civilization is a measure of peacefulness at all. Maybe of peacefulness, but not of destructive, decrease in destructive capabilities. And this is what history, I think, abundantly shows to us, right? We are at this point more dangerous, more destructive than we ever been, historically speaking, at least from a potential point of view. And still, and that's why we like this so much, because we know what it is deep inside, even if sometimes we don't rationalize it. And that's also a great risk, because that's when you start having even some some problems at realizing what it should be, the consequence of such attraction. Let's be honest about it. It's dangerous, right? It's very instinctive to be violent. It's very instinctive to be aggressive. But that's what differentiates us from other beings, and that's why we can do things that they don't. They don't, and that's why we can better our own as well as their own life. Telling the truth. And that should be remembered, but it doesn't limit our capability or our necessity to make war. And this is what von Clausewitz also cares about, because he says this is not a matter of going out there and needing to make war for the sake of it. Von Clausewitz is the first one who got his country invaded, and his people defeated, and his country invaded and occupied because of a military defeat, and military mistakes and overconfidence, whatever. So he knows better that war is not desirable, but he's concerned because war happens. That is, even if you don't want to make it, you could find yourself in the condition of having to fight one, and that's the real problem. You must know what it is, because otherwise you lose, and it doesn't change anything that you were a pacifist before. You're just done for. Aside from the fact that pacifism is truly one of the single, if not the single most violent ideology in all the history of mankind, but extremely dangerous as a consequence as well, like all all the isms. But it's still extremely meaningful to give the truly correct and accurate description what war is. This is why von Clausewitz is important, and that's why this is also a great lesson of life, because it teaches you not to consider things of what they should be corrected from someone else, from some subjective standard, but for what they really are, scientifically speaking. So not even based of your mood, right? On saying, that guy, feels so cool and smart and intelligent, so I just hate him, and therefore I will do the opposite. I will say the opposite of what he says, so I will look cool, because this is really what the political bipolarization this currently taking place really works like. It's not about, in fact, assessing reality, but just countering someone else. But this is, however, part of the von Clausewitz peculiarity of living reaction. We do clash against reacting beings, so we do react, and we cause reactions, and that's exactly what it is. So you see, even through this example, what we are doing is essentially we're modeling our action on the base of our reaction and the reaction of the enemy. And that's literally what it is, right? And we're constantly into this system. We are constantly reacting to something as much as, our actions cause reactions, right? This is even a physical principle, but you understand that while in physics you can't measure these forces and dynamics in general, when it takes human to frame the human mind in this measurements, it's impossible, and therefore you have to be as human as you can be. That's why war is actually probably the single most human thing ever, because there is no other way you can solve it otherwise, and there is no other way, no other being that makes war but humans in the real world as we define it. No, don't talk to me about ants, even if I love ants. Spent considerable time of my life reading about ants wars, but that's a wholly different story. That's we study it in entomology, in natural sciences, but it's not politics, it's not war, it's not society, right? If not just in a projected parallel depiction that we like to make, but that's not the thing von Clausewitz is talking about. What else? Okay, so von Clausewitz goes on and says, the effect which any measure produces upon the enemy is the most distinct of all the data which action affords. Right, so this, okay, we already explained it, telling the truth. No, wait, no, it's a new phrase, brand new phrase. Yes, because I reread it at the beginning, but what does this phrase mean? The effect which any measure produces upon the enemy is the most distinct of all the data which action affords. It means that this reaction that you get that you expect and you get at the same time from the enemy is actually the single most unique thing that on the basis of which you in turn model your own action. What does this mean? Well, it means basically that every situation is different at the point that and because actually of the enemy behavior, because of how the enemy reacts against you, and what you are fighting for is essentially for the enemy's mind, right? Mind and what he does, right? So what von Clausewitz is telling us here is that in every moment in war, the single most important thing you should consider is paradoxically what you can't frame into a scientific understanding, but just in true human sensitivity and without standpoints. I mean, it's not that disciplines like psychology or anthropology, etc., that do not help. Not even even those disciplines to study material things are important. But still, the single most important thing that effectively wars are fought on is what the other guy is up to. As much as what you are up to, and the two things, that the principle of reciprocal action is always there, right? So von Clausewitz says, but every theory must keep two classes or groups of phenomena and can never take up the really individual case in itself. So yes, and that's why he's saying that a positive theory should always be divided. You should always order. In fact, a factual knowledge should always be about clear categorizations and groups that you can analyze scientifically, and everything goes well if you do it. And von Clausewitz continues by saying that must everywhere be left to judgment and talent. So there is no other way but judgment and talent at that point to understand what is going on. You can't measure moral powers scientifically. So all you rely on is your judgment and talent, which your mind is capable of. This is a terribly humanly empowering idea. It's the idea that you can understand better your neighbor because you're a human like him. Now that's incredibly important. If you think about it, that our mind is able to understand other minds like no other machine can, is extraordinary. And it all happens under our eyes, and it seems normal to us because it's instinctive, we can do it. But it also requires intelligence, it does require experience. In a way, our mind is able to frame. It's astonishingly sad, too, that our potential is so limited. Like this, our mind is a miracle, is a real miracle. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, it is therefore natural that in a business such as war, which in its plan, built upon general circumstances, is so often thwarted by unexpected and singular accidents, more must generally be left to talent. And this is a great part of what Clausewitz in theory is about, right? Rejecting the idea of a scientific approach to war, because war is the singular most unexpected, let's say in terms of outcome is the singular most unexpected, unforeseeable. I don't know if it can be used, I always say it because I don't know, but unexpected, unpredictable, unpredictable system that humans can find themselves in terms of human activities, right? Interhuman activities. So that's really the big deal, and also the conditions in which this happens, in peril, ignorance of most of what is going on constantly at all times, also makes it unique, right? And the more this unpredictable character manifests itself, of course, because the reality is changed constantly, conditions are changed constantly by singular accidents, and much more we have to leave all this to talent proper. That's the real deal. And we don't have to be tricked thinking that it's just, it's a mistake or it's false or it's wrong, right? It's always like this, and there is no other way to put it. You are out there on your own, and you have to make something about this. You can't fundamentally... we got to 1,000 subscribers, so thanks to Douglas Thorson, which probably will never hear this video, but he knows he's my first 1,000 subscriber. Yeah, so we made it. Alright, so aside from this, I don't know how you say it in English, the live update, we got 1,000 subscribers, but still, see, unpredictable. I wasn't thinking about that. Instead, it happened. This notification arrived. I was thinking about, here, how the hell do I complete this sentence in English not to sound too dumb to your ears? Well, here goes, an unexpected event. Right, and this obviously is not war, but it kind of renders the idea. We live constantly in a world where weird things happen. I mean, this was not weird, but in general, unexpected things happen, and we have to deal with those. But we are incredibly well suited. I was reading something about a book about the human mind, exactly. That we are able to do things without even thinking about them. Like, we have the capacity of memorizing at the point of creating instinctive reflexes that keep track of that memory. We don't even need to consciously take them back from that moment. That happens magically. That means if someone he crosses the road unexpectedly, and I have never seen it, I freak out, maybe I crash into it. But the next time, even if I don't immediately rationalize what is going on, still my mind, if that happens again, my mind has memorized and reacts accordingly, and pull the brakes. So it's it's dramatically fascinating how we work, because unfortunately I don't think we will ever know how we actually will, if how we actually do. And this is particularly sad in a way or another, but we can do really more than what we expect, probably, at this point, in a particularly natural way. And war is definitely a situation in which this comes useful, right? Because in no other moments, like in war, these conditions are are undetermined. So fundamentally, while in normal life we have time to cope with problems, to kind of have less hurry, etc. In war, it's not like that. You're under enemy fire. What the hell do you do when you have to take decisions that will determine whether you will leave or not by the following quarter of an hour? And what the hell? So that's where you have to rely on your talent, judgment and talent. There is no other way out of that. That's why von Clausewitz says, once again, that it is therefore natural that in a business such as war, which in its plan built upon general circumstances is so often thwarted by unexpected and singular accidents, more must generally be left to talent, and less use can be made of a theoretical guide than in any other. This is the last phrase that we had stopped to after the semicolon. And less use can be made of a theoretical guide than in any other. I will repeat it ad nauseam. And less use can be made of a theoretical guide than in any other. This is probably what most people crash against, and that really can't cope with at the end of the day. It's this thing of really being refusing that there is not a manual for war, that there is not a theory that explains how you should behave. Well, this is reality. If you don't like it, it's not my problem. It's not von Clausewitz's problem, for that matter. Maybe just for him for me as well, to be reminding you. But it's how reality simply is for us. There's no other way out of that. So anyone who thinks that there can be a theoretical guide that can tell you, look, do this and things will go for the right person, in a positivistic sense, there is not, and there is not especially in war, more than in any other human activity. Which I know it's kind of depressing, but it is the case, and that's why. Okay, let's not extend too much into this, but let's be aware about the. I don't know how to put this, but even partly the fact of, I mean, as terrible as war is, there is always a way out from, if not from it properly, but let's say that as long as you are into it, there are things you can do that can change it radically. It can change radically its course, and this is of dramatic importance from a political, military, civic point of view, because if you believe this, you realize that war requires an enormous responsibility, because theoretically its potential is enormous, And aside from mass hysteria, like, now we will go at war with Iran because we killed Soleimani, but no, it won't happen, but because nobody cares about it, but between the two contenders. But the real problem is not this. It's not the fact that war has incredibly dangerous, potential, right? That's a problem, and that's we should be concerned about everything, and that's why we should be responsible. But at the same time, we should understand that this field can present us with theoretically more than in other fields as ever better options to solve that war in a positive way for us, which is not a few to think about, because if this was just a preset thing you could in fact scope through a theoretical guide, you could say, oh, well, okay, this war is bad just because this guy would kick my ass, so I won't do it. Okay, this also happens in reality, but it happens more often than in any other human activity, that even if you find yourself in this war against your will, there are ways to surpass this that do not mean that it increases the possibility of winning it, because from the other side, it's in fact, the thing is reciprocal. There is a living reaction from the other side. It's going to do the same thing, but at the same time, it makes you understand how important it is to applicate yourself into this field, because potentially the more resources you invest into it, and the more you can profit potentially from some. So this last thing I said, maybe if not controversial, I hope it's still, however, relative, because reciprocal action is there all the time. But that's why you should at least understand and always be mindful of the intrinsic responsibility that this thing entails, right? That's the single most important thing. And yeah, this is more or less what we could say today, which I hope is somewhat interesting for you, even if I'm so preachy and annoying and bad at saying what I'm saying, because I am objectively, but I am doing this just because I believe it can do a good service, not because I have anything to gain myself, if not to live in a better world where people are a bit more responsible, or a bit more here, what is that, alright, whatever, further news, further messages now I'm getting from whatever. Alright, so for today we can't stop it here. We will go on with von Clausewitz. I'm happy that we arrived at a interesting point in his... it's always interesting to study him, but, in terms of amount of stuff we said, now we started getting really into the core, and it's great read, and I hope that you enjoy this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.